Hello and welcome to the No Horse Bar Witchcraft podcast. And Chris, have you ever had labour pains whilst giving birth?
Not in this lifetime.
No, because I
Many a
think there's a
lifetimes
couple of
before.
people. There's a couple of people out there that are having labour pains with their metaphysically magical things. Let's just say things that they're trying to birth, right? Because I think a lot of people thinking labour pains is in maybe as childbirth, but actually today I'd like to talk about birth of a different kind, which is the magical birth, the birthing of
Baby Jesus.
tulpas, egregores. Well, it's funny you should mention Jesus. Tulpas, egregores, and homoculin and thought forms and the like, because there's people that are struggling, really struggling with this, and I think I understand why they're struggling, and I think that they are subscribing too much to the lower forms of magic, such as the thought forms, and applying that understanding to when they're trying to do big, more complicated things, right? Because it's a little different a birth in a one thing compared to a something else. So I was wondering, egregores, tulpas, anything like that, anything you would like to say about the process of creating them or the practice in general or anything before I do a little rant?
Okay. All I'll say is make sure you've always got a coat hanger handy just in case you don't like what you've created.
Well,
No?
I mean, you're not supposed to abort the children after they've been created, Chris, because this is the difference, right? Because this is what I'm seeing it with the children birth,
Am I supposed to use a
birthing of the
bathtub?
humans and the like. You're supposed to, like, abort them beyond a certain point. So when it gets past a certain point, you're proper committed, right? And then after the birthing process, that now becomes murder. So the coat hanger don't work. You could end it with a coat hanger, but there are other ways of doing it, right? But you're talking when you make the coat hanger joke. I'm presuming about aborting the project halfway through doing the project. So doing a Crowley where you start it and then you fuck off to another country, fuck off to France or something.
No, I just wanted to kind of highlight the point that often people feel like once the spell is done, that there is no growth period. So kind of they would think of it, to use a pregnancy analogy, they would think the spell time, those 10 minutes they spend meditating or whatever the fuck they do, is actually the 9 months of the 9 months of gestation, where actually a lot of these things, the gestation point starts after the first spell working is done. Then there's a gestation period until it grows up. Kind of more like an elephant, you know, how like you hold it for 2 years and then you cough up pretty much a complete elephant.
Right, so some of these witches that are currently attempting the magical work known as egregore creation are trying to squeeze a fully formed walking, talking man out of their hooch. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what
when it don't work like that. Because there's a certain amount of effort that needs to be put into growing it in the incubator, and then the birthing process, and then there's growing after that, evolution and such after the birthing process, right?
So technically, after that first spell, they can still coat hanger it for at least how long before it's actually, you know, a formation. And then after that, it's still got evolution points where you can still put it down if you need to.
So, yeah. So basically, the one thing that I'd like to say is that tulpas, egregores, thought forms are not interchangeable language.
Oh, terminology.
They're lumped together because they're similar, but they're not actually the same thing. So if you go about trying to create an egregore, that is different than how you would go about creating a tulpa and going about creating a thought form. Because the whole thought form thing that you hear a little bit about in occultism is pretty much mostly accidental. You know, it's that kind of thing as like, oh, I kind of threw a little bit too much energy at that, and I kind of unconsciously made that thing, and it took on a life of its own type thing. But that isn't sophisticated. It's not for sophisticated. And the tulpas is just, oh, the right conditions have been met for a little spark of life that takes the form of whatever structure it can basically hold. So a lot of these even cartoons and stuff like that, I mean, how many people end up meeting fucking superheroes and shit on the astral realm because there are so many people that actually worship them and feed into that they bump into these things, you know, or you know, the creepy Mr. Beanie, weird shadow man that haunts the woods type thing. How many of that actually is? If enough people believe in that, then it kind of takes on a life force. That's tulpas. Tulpas are quite weak and take a long time to grow and evolve. And that is like watching the evolutionary process of some soup and expecting it automatically to be some higher level life form when actually it needs to go through a whole evolutionary process. The difference with egregores is that you are to a certain extent skipping that. So what you're saying is, I don't really want to look at this soup and wait a couple of 100 millions of years or however long and see if a human evolves or what evolves. I want to make a human. I'm not just waiting for something to happen. Oh, look, a human came along. Is no, I really want this specific thing, and it needs to be this smart, this powerful, this, you know, have these abilities, exist in these various different realms and such. And that's created from the planning process. Now, egregore creation should be complicated for the reason that complication equals planning. So the reason why egregore creation is complicated is because you're planning all the minute details of it. You're planning what it is. You're planning how it works. You're planning its anatomy. All of that. That's why egregore creation is complex, because you need to understand what you're doing to make one that can actually survive and work. Thought forms are an accidental thing, which is why they tend not to be particularly powerful or last very long. Now, some people get confused with power and think that because a poltergeist or something like that can fling a bunch of shit around the room that is somehow powerful. Well, then no, that's not true. You can accidentally create thought forms that a lot of mundanes would cry thinking is some kind of higher demon or some shit like that, because it makes a candle flutter or it picked up a rock or a chair and threw it at you. That's not the case. We're not talking about power from that perspective. All of that sort of stuff can be done by accident. And poltergeist is probably not the best example to use, because a lot of poltergeist activity ends up coming from witches with unhealthy
psychic energy,
unhealthy levels of psychic energy that aren't being harnessed properly, and unhealthy what is it, unhealthy and unsanitary magical conditions. They don't awash themselves magically. So it all builds up the scum, and then the scum kind of takes up on, or appears to take on, a life force of its own. But anyway, we specifically need to talk about, I think, egregore creation on this specific episode, because what I don't want people doing is I don't want people going away and thinking, I'm going to write a petition. I'm going to sign it and say I want it to do this, 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 and this. I throw a bunch of energy at it, and there we go. Because that would be a thought form. Okay.
Oh,
these
like
people
on Make Me a Date. That
that
episode.
That sort of thing would be more of a thought form. That sort of thing would be more, I don't like all of these rules and laws. I want to do magic my way, not fucking knowing what you're doing and just throwing a bunch of energy at a concept, because that's how tulpas and thought forms are made. But that's not how egregores are made, because egregores are more sophisticated and they run on the system. Okay, so
right, just to hammer this home, I feel like we go over them again and be specific. So I will always liken tulpas to fucking Santa Claus. I think that's a really good example. They're often accidentally made real tulpas that last normally have to be community created and often require parts of many people believing in something that is available. So that is small amounts of energy from lots of people, mostly belief based, or almost always accidental. So whereas the difference would be for another communal based one, I would often talk about fetches. And fetches I often only associate with covens often. Obviously you can make individual fetches, but I find often the most common version of a fetch is a coven that creates an entity that has a specific job, but not complicated, a very simple, a guard dog, or, like I said, fetch. It's in the name. It's sent off to go and pull something in that you need. It completes one task at a time, is kind of how I often categorize a fetch. The tricky ones I find difficult to kind of explain, which you're better at. But I'll ask you to do Homoculin in a moment. But the other one I think we often forget, which I think is where people get confused, which is the other reason why I'm bringing this up, is you mentioned low magics earlier, and often people will go the kind of golem approach and think that is egregore creation. Where actually, when you've got something like a golem that has a foundation in the physical, and you cook them almost, it's part of the whole casting and then breathing life and then kind of cooking it in some way. So whether or not that is, a kiln for clay or baked goods, when they make these kind of flour and dough kind of ones, that all to me is golem creation. When you've got something that has such a physical body, that is often that I don't consider to be an egregore. Whether or not you'd disagree, but to me, I like to categorically say the difference. Golem is a very specific kind of creation that has a real seat in the physical, and therefore its physicality is its off switch. So it's automatically built in because of the process that's taken to actually make it. And then I think you cover Homoculin before you go on another rant about egregores.
I wasn't going to talk about Homoculin because I don't want them getting any bad ideas, because it's dangerous enough as it is. And I know one or two people are technically attempting to master some of the techniques that would be required to have to actually make a successful Homoculin. But you're talking about something coming from a very specific culture as well, aren't you, with regards to that? So in terms of obviously the kind of Jewish story time, that kind of thing, the thing is you could take various different approaches to creating that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, or to the untrained eye at least, you may think, oh, that fetch, Liam and Chris, they said that fetch is not an egregore, therefore I'm coming across something that acts like a fetch or seems to be a fetch, therefore, Liam and Chris were either wrong or this isn't a fetch. What you need to remember is that it is not about the finished product so much and what you label the finished product as and what the finished product looks like. What it is the process of creation, right? So what we're talking about is there's a difference between pottery and ironmongery. Is a very clear difference. I could get a blacksmith to make a cauldron, right? And I can get a potter to make a bowl, right? Those two things might look similar, but they are completely different processes and they're made out of different things. Also, one's stronger than the other and can do certain things that the other one can't, right? This is what we're talking about there. So maybe you've got a potter to make a clay cauldron and a blacksmith to make an iron cauldron. Both of them look similar, and both of them technically you could even argue are cauldrons, but the process is different. And you need to understand this, because the processes for making these different things sound similar, but they're actually very, very, very different. So the process for making a thought form is either purposefully, but with not a huge amount of effort and no input from things external to the magician or the small group. So we're talking about these sorts of things being accidental, or we're talking about I'm using my energy to sustain this creature, my own energy, right? Tulpas very often are energy being pushed into something, and it normally is a basic frame and mold that, like Chris said, a community tends to shape. So if it's a ghost haunting of some kind of weirdo forest or something like that, and local legend of an axe murderer or something, then that's the sort of thing that if you get 100 people believing in it, right, it might not necessarily be enough for there to be a manifestation of a physical axe man that lives in the woods that's not a human, right? But there is a certain amount of that framework that can exist, even if it just exists in the minds of the people that share the story. If enough actual energy gets pushed into that, then yes, people will start having experiences with an Axeman in the forest. Maybe some corporeal thing, maybe some non-corporeal thing. But it's about energy and having that force. So if you think about the basic thought form as the person needs to maintain that energy and that framework, with the crowdfunding, as it were, with the Tulpa, then that is a joint effort. Generally speaking, is a joint effort from people that are unaware of what they're actually doing. Now, you do get some people, as I can remember from certain past lives, where people understand this. And what they do is they try and manipulate this. They might find something, some sort of tulpa, and then they'll act as a priest or a priestess and build a little cult up around it, so that what they can do is they can manipulate this framework. Okay. Now, I know that's super complicated. We haven't talked about how that actually happens yet. But it is super important to get the gist that these are different things, right? You can't just say, oh, I want to make this spirit that can go and do that thing, and I've decided that I'm going to light a candle and I'm going to write it down, I'm going to draw a picture of it, and then I'm going to make it out of a little bit of clay, and then that's going to be an egregore, because that's not a fucking egregore. That would be a thought form. Okay. If you made a basic framework, perhaps, didn't necessarily breathe the life into it, but pushed that framework out into the greater world, and people started to adopt it, that would probably turn into a tulpa. There's a well-known tulpa called Seren that certain people are aware of. That isn't no birthing process. None of the work, none of the breath has been breathed into that necessarily. All that was given was a framework to attract energy towards that framework. And when enough energy permeates and binds to that framework, then there will be a life that springs out of it, given the right conditions. And that will evolve, okay, past the framework is very often what happens. With egregore creation, you're talking about designing the perfect machine. You're talking about actually designing a robot, okay? So with that, you are designing. And the real difference between egregore creation and thought forms and that is that egregore creations are true standalone life forms, true standalone spirits that are not necessarily linked to you. And you have a soul, as everyone else has a soul, and that soul has many different component parts and aspects that exist on many different planes. In order to create an egregore, that egregore will have a soul. And that soul will have aspects and energetic bodies that exist in all these places. If you want to make an egregore, you need to understand how to make a soul, because that's exactly what you're fucking doing when you're making an egregore. Okay? If you're making a thought form or something, all you really need to know how to do is how to blow up a fucking hot air balloon and then keep the heat applied, and then you'll have that thought form. So birthing an egregore is a much more complicated process. And the way most, I was going to say simpletons, but that's rude. The way most beginner witches go about doing it, if they want to do it, is to get the assistance of what would be referred to as gods and deities, and that the underpinning energetic bodies that exist, the currents of existence, because your egregore is going to need to exist in all of these places. Therefore, is going to need, if you're a witch or a person with not a huge amount of ability, beginner witch, beginner magician, something like that, you're going to need the assistance of those things that are capable of working in those realms that you can't work. That's why the birthing process of an egregore starts from the top down, okay? And the last part is the astral world, or the physical body, if you want it to exist in the physical world. It goes from the top down, much like the birthing process of any fucking piece of life exists from the top down. It's a falling, the fall, yeah? So with that, you need to think, well, okay, I have a physical body, I have an astral body, and then I have another type of body, and then I have another type of body, and then I have another type of body, and then there's all of these different energies that creates a framework that is you, that is an aspect of you. Remember, we talked about the tree and the branches and the leaves and all that sort of thing. You are creating all of that if you're creating an egregore. It is fucking big work, right? Which I think people don't fully understand that. So please do not think that somehow creating thought forms and tulpas is somehow not worthwhile, because you use tools for specific uses, don't you, Chris? So we're not shitting on people that make thought forms and tulpas and that sort of thing. But people that are attempting to make an egregore, please realize that you need to be working on a much bigger level than just blowing fucking hot air into a balloon that's shaped like the Rushball Man from Ghostbusters. Because that's what you're doing when it comes to like tulpas and thought forms. It is just, you've created a shape, you need energy to inhabit that shape, and then it will move about and eventually it'll die out. Not too dissimilar from dissolving of humans and such, when the heat's no longer applied. But yeah, I don't know where you want to go with this, because it's such a vast subject, and there are so many people that I know that want to go through the process and understand the process. But in terms of how sophisticated an egregore you can make, it's going to very much depend on what your ability is, because you're going to be able to get so far and make something, but whether it's going to be something that really does last or is capable of moving outside of this universe, or this branch, shall I say, is fucking complicated. But I don't know if you've got any stories or anything that you can tell that might illustrate the point, or anything to add to this.
I kind of want to make a useful conversation that we had with Anyanka about her way of explaining one of the versions she was trying to do, where she actually likened it to the fact, well, I know how to give birth because I've done it as a mother. And obviously this only works for the ladies listening, but actually having an understanding of what is involved in order to cook a baby.
Well, she's only done half the process. Well, I say half the process. She's only done potentially a seventh of the process, because she's done the biological part. She didn't create the soul in the first place. That's
No,
like
but
buying a computer and saying, I put together a computer. Did you make the operating system? Well, no, I didn't make the operating system. I bought that from Microsoft. That's basically what that is. There's the difference between aggregate creation and thought forms.
Yeah, but
Sorry,
my
I
point is
interrupted.
that it's built. Well, you do. So the point of what she's trying to point out is actually the physicality part of it. She's used to actually doing on a physical realm, and has an understanding of how the other parts, the metaphysical parts, slot in, but actually not really understanding that actually a big part of the factory that is a woman is built and designed in order to produce souls. So, the actually having an understanding of kind of go, okay, well, my body is actually designed create souls. So what I'm needing to do is tap into that natural part of being a woman, and being able to kind of go, okay, well, I know I need to birth it. I know it needs the right situation. It needs the timing to be right. It needs the DNA part. So obviously the actual intelligence that is actually being created, and then obviously I need to breathe life into it and then keep it alive. So even understanding that much of it based on what a human child is required for a human child gives you enough of an idea of, okay, if I suddenly stop feeding it, or it loses access to a food source, it's going to die. If I leave it somewhere it's not supposed to be, it's likely to die. Like, do you know what I mean? There are lots of parallels that you can draw from the kind of thought process of child and childbirth. But what's interesting about the way that that's processing is that's reliant on the innate knowledge of the factory that is you. And the fact that actually in that situation you're only one of the factories. There are two factories required in order to make a human child, and both of them have half of the instructions. So the ability to hold life and it to transition through you, yes, is part of the woman's natural role, but actually understanding the difference and what is required in order to make that perfect recipe in that moment is actually closer to golem creation or thought form creation rather than egregore creation. Because like you say, it's like creating glium. It's a robot situation where you need to have considered all the engineering that's required, but also being able to program its limitations.
So from the bottom down is the fall, is the way that humans are here, is from the going from the top and working down. Okay, now humans don't understand very often that unless they're particularly adept or experienced magicians, occultists, or witches. That is really what egregore creation is working from a top-down model. Thought forms and that are working from the bottom up. Now, it does not mean that one technically could not create something that was as powerful as an egregore eventually. But when you work from the bottom up, that is growing, like growing a tree. It's growing up from the ground. So all of those component parts that are necessary to integrate it into, let's say, existence on all of the planes, you are starting with one plane, and the plane you're starting with is the physical world. You're creating a physical model, physical body for it. And then what you're doing is you're growing and maturing it into other places, okay, into other planes. And it is evolving, but it's evolving going upwards. Egregore creation doesn't work like that. Egregore creation is, I've done that bit, I've done that bit. As I'm going down, I'm completing a checklist, and all of a sudden I hit that compiler, that run program, and all of a sudden the program's online. Okay. where it doesn't quite work like that with the fault form thing. The fault form is basically, I've put a brick there, I'm this much closer to making a house,